Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. I hope you're ready for a new historical mystery because this is what I have in store for you tonight. This time we're sitting in a camp near the pyramids of Giza. The setting of our first story is the suburbs of the gigantic city of Cairo, teeming with life, but our story takes place more than 4,000 years ago. And when the sun goes down, we will begin our journey back in time. The buildings disappear, everything becomes silent, and the pyramids return to their past splendor. Taller than today, smooth, white, and bright at sunset. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. Also, we just launched a Patreon page for those who wish to support this project and get more of it. If you join it, you will get various new things like the possibility to listen to all episodes with background sounds, as well as without them. You will also get bonus episodes. The first one about the history of glassmaking and stained glass is already available there. You will be able to download all these audios, and you will also have your say on the choices of topics, advanced releases, and updates on upcoming episodes. We hope to see you there soon so that we may continue developing Lights Out Library, which we enjoy so much. You will find links in the description box and the first comment pinned under the video. If you fall asleep and wish to resume to the video later, or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are also listed in the description and also pinned in the first comment. You will also find links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. But before we begin, assume a comfortable position. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you exhale, release the tension in your shoulders, your neck. Release the tension in your facial muscles too, and allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. The complex reappears at the foot of the Great Pyramid, linking it to the river. Apart from this, all we can see around us are the sands of ancient Egypt. We've arrived, so let's get started. What we see of the Great Pyramid and the smaller pyramids that surround it today is its central structure, not what it was in the 26th century BC. Back then, when it was brand new and for centuries, the pyramid was covered in a soft white limestone shell, making it not only shiny, but also taller than it is today. It initially measured 481 feet, or nearly 147 meters. But this outer shell was either removed or reused or dropped, reducing its height by nearly 30 feet, or 9 meters. Despite this, it remained the tallest man-made structure in the world for more than 3,500 years. There are many dubious claims about this monument. For example, that it would be proof that the Egyptians had advanced technology, or that it was built by extraterrestrials. This is not what we're going to discuss tonight because these stories about the Great Pyramid are unfounded. The pyramids are ultimately huge piles of stones. Its size, its aesthetics, its precision, its function, the social organization that made its construction possible. And these are all fascinating subjects, but still, they are nothing more than a pile of stones. No sign of advanced technology that would have surpassed what is attributed to the ancient Egyptians was found in or near them. The question is rather how a society of the third millennium BC, equipped with only technical means that are now very rudimentary for us, how and why did they devote so much effort to building these monuments? How were blocks of this size cut, brought in, and put together so tightly, all by hand? Taken together, and despite the loss of mass of the Great Pyramid over centuries, these blocks represent 92 million cubic feet, or 2.6 million cubic meters. What were the challenges faced by architects and workers, and how did they build the pyramid? Here's what we're going to examine. We will also visit the interior of the Great Pyramid and, obviously, because it is inseparable, we will talk about Khufu, the pharaoh for whom the pyramid was built. So, to begin with, who was Khufu, also known as Cheops? He was the second pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty of ancient Egypt, at a time when Egypt had been unified, north and south, for generations and already had an ancient culture and ancient traditions. But very few of the iconic monuments that represent this civilization today. Khufu succeeded his father, Sneferu, and ruled for a long time, at least 26 years, and possibly as many as 46 years, according to modern historians. He could have commissioned other buildings besides the pyramid. He possibly did. But they have been lost, and the only intact and certified portrait of the king is a small figurine that was made long after his death. Other statues and reliefs were found in fragments, which is not surprising for a pharaoh who lived 4.5 millennia ago. We know almost nothing of what happened during his reign, internally or externally. There are inscriptions that mention sending expeditions to find turquoise and copper mines, or trade contracts with the city of Byblos in Lebanon. There are also papyrus fragments found relatively recently, 10 years ago, and dating back to 4,500 years around the time of Khufu's reign, which are administrative records, letters sent to the pharaoh that shed light on the administration of Egypt at the time. They confirmed shipment of food and supplies to the sailors or workers on the wall. This is valuable, but it doesn't say much about the events that happened during the reign of Khufu. So, how can we be sure that this pyramid is his? In fact, it was traditionally attributed to Khufu in ancient Egypt, and early Greek historians wrote about it, supporting this attribution. But in the Middle Ages, other people were credited with the construction. For example, Nimrod, a biblical figure described as a king in Mesopotamia, or King Sorid, a legendary king of medieval Coptic and Islamic rule. Coptic means belonging to the Copts, and the Copts are a Christian ethnic and religious group from Egypt and Sudan. Thus, when the science of Egyptology was formed in the 19th century, it wasn't sure which pharaoh had built the pyramid. Between all these different claims and the absence of visible inscriptions on the pyramid itself until 1837. That year, exploration of the interior revealed new chambers where workers had marked the blocks with hieroglyphs, graffiti that gave the names of their factions or groups, their teams. All of these names referred to Khufu, and later, other inscriptions with the name Khufu were found in a quarry where the blocks came from. Finally, in the 20th century, more tomb discoveries at the Giza site confirmed that the pyramid was Cheops's because his wives, his children, and grandchildren, and also high officials were buried around the site. Therefore, there is no doubt at this point that the correct attribution was the ancient one, the one mentioned by the Greek historians. It is now known where the stone blocks came from, how they were quarried and transported, and of course, that this pyramid was intended to serve as a tomb. But looking at all this in detail, there are still a lot of unknowns. So let's take a look at what these unknowns actually are. In total, the pyramid consists of about 2.3 million blocks. And on average, the blocks weigh more than 2 tons. They are made of different materials, different types of stone. The most common blocks are limestone, and most of them were quarried at Giza, just south of the pyramid. So they didn't need to travel far. It is believed that they were taken to the site and placed on some sort of sled. We'll talk in a minute about the construction techniques. But there were other materials as well, for example, the white roof of the pyramid, which was also made of limestone, but of a different type. These blocks came from another quarry about 6 miles south of the pyramid and were probably transported by ship. We know this specifically because the papyrus scrolls from the 2013 discovery I mentioned earlier describe deliveries of limestone blocks and other building materials from this quarry to the Giza site in the last year of Khufu's reign. What is more impressive in terms of distance is the presence of hundreds of granite blocks that were transported from Aswan in southern Egypt to northern Giza. The distance was 900 kilometers or 560 miles, and the largest of these blocks weigh between 25 and 80 tons each. Granite is a very hard stone, and these large blocks were used to make different things inside the pyramid, including the roof of a room within the pyramid called the King's Chamber, which we will visit later, as well as other chambers above it, called the relief chambers, because their function was to distribute and support the weight of the blocks above them to prevent a collapse. The technique used to quarry granite and other stones is well documented. The Egyptians dug holes in the stones and inserted wooden wedges. They soaked the wood with water, and these wedges absorbed it. They expanded and broke pieces of stone that could be worked. This gave them rough blocks that they could then manually cut to refine, give them the requested dimensions, and polish them. But who worked in the quarries and at the pyramid site? A widespread belief in ancient times was that slave labor was used, but it was based more on the beliefs of foreigners, especially the Greeks, who practiced slavery on a large scale. The Egyptians did too, but they were never supporters of slavery, and that's another issue. But it's hard to distinguish between the various categories of forced and unpaid labor that existed in ancient Egypt. People could be tied for life to a temple or a family, but it is not obvious whether they were servants, laborers, or royal slaves in the sense we give to this word, because generally they retained some rights, such as having personal possessions, belongings, or contracting transactions voluntarily, and could not be sold as assets. Therefore, there were a variety of situations and rights. It evolved over time, but the only people with a status that corresponds to the modern definition of slavery were convicted people who were stripped of their rights as punishment, or foreign captives from Nubia or the Middle East. What did exist on a large scale, however, was a system of forced labor, that is, forced labor for peasants. When they didn't need to work in the fields, they could be drafted into labor, or sometimes an army that served the pharaoh or local nobles. It is believed that most of the great Egyptian monuments were built like this by conscripted workers. So they left their villages for a few months and were sent to Giza or quarries to work there. They were fed and given shelter, and then they could return to their families. Their work was either a gift or an obligation to the pharaoh. Now, how many workers were needed? Because the question is, was it possible to cut more than 2 million blocks of stone in a period of about 27 years, the time it took to construct the pyramid? That's about 250 blocks each day on average. And this is one of the reasons why some people doubted that the pyramid could have been built in this time period with the rudimentary tools the Egyptians had at their disposal. So, archaeological experiments were carried out to see how it was possible, and if possible, with reproductions of Egyptian tools, such as copper chisels, wooden mallets, ropes, and stone tools. An experiment like this took place in 2017 in an abandoned quarry in Kyops, and it seems that with these tools and having gained a bit of experience in a few days, including in particular the discovery that was much easier when limestone was wet with water, 4 workers could extract a 2.5-ton block in less than a day. Taking into account the other tasks, giving the blocks the proper measurements and polishing them, it was estimated that the quarries could have produced 250 blocks a day with a workforce of 3,500 stone masons. Therefore, it was proven, because 3,500 men was far less than the labor force that a pharaoh of Egypt had at his disposal. Another study in 1999 estimated that assuming construction had lasted 27 years, the total project would have required an average workforce of about 13,000 people. For example, 3,000 to 4,000 in the quarries and about 10,000 working in transportation and construction. There would have been peaks in construction activity between harvest seasons with up to 40,000 workers, and slower periods. But considering that Egypt in the 22nd century BC had a population of between 1 and 5 million inhabitants, this is another estimate given by Egyptologists. The mobilization of 40,000 workers at the time of maximum activity seems feasible. These experiments are very valuable because they respond to claims that the construction of the Great Pyramid was impossible with the numbers and means that the Egyptians had. People did the work of cutting blocks with the same tools, timed it, extrapolated it, and checked it. It was a huge and complicated task, but not impossible. Something that helped build a little faster is that only the visible outer blocks, or the blocks that make up the walls of the inner chambers, fit perfectly and are perfectly polished. The central blocks, which would be invisible once the pyramid was completed, were only roughly shaped, with debris inserted between larger gaps. In addition, mortar was used to fill the gaps and joints. Thus, only a minority of blocks, still tens of thousands, but not all, were carefully shaped and polished. The rest was still somewhat precise, but much rougher. Now, apart from the realization and assembly of so many heavy blocks, the pyramid is also an architectural challenge, a work of great precision. The four sides were almost exactly the same length, 756 feet, 230 meters. The angles are almost perfectly right, and the square that is the base of the pyramid was measured to have only a very minimal error of 12 arc seconds. That is almost nothing. The length of one side was exactly 440 cubits, an ancient unit of length used by the Egyptians and also by the Sumerians, which was based on the distance from the cubit to the middle finger. Of course, in construction, it was standardized, as were feet, because this distance varies between people. The slope of the pyramid was also almost perfect, and this slope was used on all smooth pyramids, such as those at Giza. So they look the same. They have exactly the same proportions. The Egyptians described slopes by counting the cubits. How much ran down a cubit of elevation? In the case of the pyramids, the slope, seen as perfect, was 14 to 11. This ratio equates to about 51 to 52 degrees of slope. The pyramid is also closely aligned with the cardinal points. The side faces geographically to the north, east, west, and south. Geographic rather than magnetic, because there is a small difference. Magnetic north is that given by a compass, pointing to the magnetic pole. Geographic north and other directions depend on the sun. The Egyptians had no knowledge of the magnetic pole or compasses, so for them the north was geographical, but the difference is very small. How could they achieve this near perfect alignment with the cardinal points? There are no certainties here, but there are several theories. One of them is that they used a vertical rod to track their shadows throughout the day. A circle would have been drawn around the base of the rod, and the shadow line intersects with this circle. In this way, they could have obtained an east-west line and positioned north and south by drawing another line at right angles to it. Another possibility is that they followed the North Star, which then was used to indicate north and be almost perfectly fixed in the sky. Or perhaps they did so by tracking two other stars, Miser and Kochab, which appeared in a vertical line on the horizon near the north in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. In any case, they did it with one of those methods, and with great precision for the time. They probably solved other problems with that kind of simple but cunning method as well. For example, another hypothesis is that to make sure the base of the pyramid was perfectly flat, they may have filled the square with water and checked the level on either side, like some sort of giant bubble level. All this shows that, as simple as the form was, the construction of the pyramid was also an engineering project. It wasn't just about stacking blocks. It required calculations, anticipation, and the location of the building was full of meaning to the Egyptians. Perhaps the most important question of all is, how did these large, heavy blocks get to the top? Obviously, there were no cranes or motors, so it had to be built entirely by hand, by pulling or pushing the blocks. In fact, the blocks placed higher up in the structure are smaller, not as thick, and somewhat lighter than the blocks near the base, but they still weighed hundreds of pounds or kilograms. The pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty, which include the pyramids of Giza and the smaller ones, were built by the successors of Khufu. These pyramids are made entirely of stone blocks, but later, during the Middle Kingdom in the 2nd millennium BC, techniques changed, and most of the pyramids were made internally of mud bricks, and this mountain of bricks was encased in a polished limestone veneer. So externally they looked the same, but they also didn't stand the test of time. The carcass fell off or was taken away, and the bricks deteriorated. This is why the later pyramids look older or more damaged than the pyramids at Giza, because they weren't as strong internally. Aside from the blocks, the Great Pyramid required a lot of debris to fill in the gaps between the blocks, as I said before. They were crudely cut when they weren't visible. This rubble fill has almost no binding properties, but the construction needed to be stabilized. It also required a large amount of gypsum mortar, thousands of tons, and this could be one of the reasons why the construction of such large pyramids did not last. The plaster had to be dehydrated by heating, which required enormous amounts of wood. Some Egyptologists have suggested that the construction of the pyramids of Giza and some other earlier pyramids might have stripped Egypt of almost all of its forests. Wood was never abundant in Egypt. It is possible that the construction of these great stone pyramids was halted simply because there wasn't enough wood left to continue, or because it became obviously irresponsible. Returning to the question of how the blocks were moved to the superstructure, there is no known precise historical or archaeological evidence that definitively resolves the question. Therefore, all we have are hypotheses that are possibilities backed up by what we know of the capabilities of the Egyptians, but certainties are not. The most sustainable of the methods of lifting the blocks seems to be ramps because the slope of the pyramid is too steep to pull or push the blocks up. There is archaeological evidence that ramps were used, but only evidence of small ramps or sloping causeways, something that could not explain the method of construction. One of the first hypotheses was that a large straight ramp was built by stacking earth, and then it was raised by stacking more as the pyramid climbed. But it was discredited on functional grounds because its mass would have been almost identical to that of the pyramid itself. That would have involved a huge labor cost to build it first and then remove it entirely. And it would be hard to imagine that it left no trace, because miles around the site of Giza, there was only sand and rock. So, how do you build and remove such a massive ramp with that? Even though a single large ramp isn't technically impossible, most experts rule it out. That's the heart of the mystery surrounding the construction of the pyramid, because all other options have their problems. They include zigzagging ramps supported by the structure or spinal ramps to the top. Again, these are possible, but how do you make them stick to the structure? And is it really optimal to have these very heavy blocks spiral around the structure and ultimately cover a long distance? When an average of 200 to 300 blocks per day needs to be added for 27 years. It is documented that the blocks could have traveled significant distance on sleds. They were pooled with water to lubricate the surface and make it easier. But the difficulties with ramps is why it is speculated that the actual lifting of the blocks at the end of their journey could have been done with a lever system, such as small wooden cranes, perhaps only towards the top of the building, because the upper third of its height represents only 4% of its mass. In that case, a lever system for the higher parts could have been supplemented by ramps for the lower levels. But the use of levers is not documented. We know that the Egyptians had a lever system for irrigation called shaduf, which was used to move water easily with minimal effort. But there is no formal evidence that a larger, more robust version of that was used at Giza. Now, the pyramids, before the white limestone roof was applied to smooth its surface, had small steps. So maybe a multiplicity of these systems could have lifted the blocks step by step. There are more hypotheses that tend to be rejected by mainstream academia. For example, that there was an internal ramp system, that the pyramid was not built from scratch, but around a core as a series of spiral levels. So the structure of the pyramid itself would have been used as a ramp. This is often dismissed because of its complexity and lack of evidence. It might be technically possible, but it seems like a long shot. Another theory, which is widely rejected, was that the Egyptians did not actually bring the blocks. They made them directly in situ and on top of the monument with a kind of limestone concrete. What we would take as blocks would actually be concrete. There are many arguments against that, and they include the fact that the analysis of the blocks points to regular limestone, or the fact that there are quarries where the blocks were cut. Even the shapes of the blocks separated from the rock are visible. So why would they have bothered to mine all these blocks if they didn't need to? Therefore, the construction techniques remain somewhat mysterious at this point. actually is not that there are no explanations at all. There are several that seem possible, but none of them seem entirely satisfactory. Hence the idea that there might have been a combination of methods for lifting and placing the blocks. But what we lack is definitive proof. Now that we have talked about the exterior and the hypotheses about the building, let's take a look at the interior and also the complex that once surrounded the pyramids, which very little remains, but this is important to understand its function. For the size of the monument, there's not much inside. Essentially, there are three main chambers, a passage called the Grand Gallery, and several smaller corridors and shafts. Initially, there was only one entrance to the pyramid. It is located on the north side, and the entrance is topped by a row of double chevrons that deflect the weight of it. This entrance opens onto a small, narrow descending passage. The entrance is about 56 feet or 17 meters above the ground, above the level of the base, and this interior passage descends approximately to the level of the base before beginning to rise again. The second entrance, called the Thieves' Tunnel, was excavated at a lower level than the main entrance, and this passage, excavated in stone, joins the descending passage. It is not known exactly when this tunnel was dug, possibly during the time of ancient Egypt or later, but it was already here in the Middle Ages. At the end of this descending passage, there is a square hole in the ceiling, and through this hole, you can access another ascending passage, one that takes you towards the center of the pyramid, where the room called the King's Chamber is located. This opening in the ceiling is not practical at all, and was obviously not intended to be a corridor for people to circulate. It was just a way to bring the pharaoh's mummy and his treasures to the burial chamber before closing the pyramid for good. It is believed that this entrance was hidden by a block initially, and putting it on the roof was a way to hide it, but it was found and removed a long time ago. Now, the descending passage does not end here. It keeps descending into the bedrock, and this was presumably excavated before the pyramid was built on top of it. It leads to an underground chamber. This one is 27 meters or 89 feet below the level of the base, so it's very deep underground and quite large. It is rectangular and measures approximately 27 feet by 46 feet, or 8 by 14 meters, with an approximate height of 4 meters, 13 feet. This size contrasts with other chambers and, even more so, with all the corridors and passageways, which are very narrow. This wasn't necessarily a choice. The weight of the pyramid is such that you can't have large voids inside. But in this underground chamber, deep in the bedrock, it was possible. The exact function of this underground chamber is unknown. If there was anything here, it was removed a long time ago, because this chamber was already well known in ancient times. Greek authors such as Herodotus mentioned it, and it was already empty back then. It has been suggested that it may have been the burial chamber intended for Khufu, but that it would have been abandoned during the construction of the other chamber, located higher up, the king's chamber. So, going back to where the ascending passage began, if we take it at about 130 feet away, that is 40 meters, moving up inside the pyramid, we get to a point where we can keep going and enter a narrow but very high gallery called the Grand Gallery, or we can take a horizontal passage. The Grand Gallery leads to the King's Chambers, while the horizontal passage leads to a room called the Queen's Chambers. It is called the Queen's Chamber, but its function is unknown. In reality, the kings and queens of ancient Egypt would be buried in the same site, which is not in the same tomb. So the function of this room is unknown, and it was also found empty. It had been violated by looters long ago. This queen's chamber is located exactly halfway between the north and south faces of the pyramid. It is obvious that having this room was planned from the beginning. It wasn't cut into the blocks, but was paved and walled, and has a pointed roof, again, most likely to distribute the weight above it. Going back to the horizontal passage and going up the Grand Gallery, we can reach the King's Chamber. This Grand Gallery is stunning. It's narrow, and it gets narrower as we go up. Its width decreases from 7 feet or 2 meters at the beginning to only 3.5 feet or 1 meter at the end. But the ceiling is 28 feet high. So, in the complete darkness of the pyramid, it was too far away to be seen. At the end of the gallery is the last line of defense of the king's chamber, an antechamber that was designed to house portcullis blocking stones. 3 large granite stones, gates, were placed in grooves and dropped, supposedly after the pharaoh was buried. The stones were thick, about 20 inches or 50 centimeters thick each. But obviously they weren't enough because they could still be destroyed, and they were. In addition, the antechamber had a design flaw. A space was left above these large stones, between its top and the ceiling, so that they could be circumvented, except for the last one. Crossing the antechamber, we finally reach the king's chamber, which is located approximately halfway between the base and the top of the pyramid. It was found empty, with only a broken stone sarcophagus where the mummy of Khufu was supposedly once placed, probably surrounded by the artifacts and treasures that would accompany him in the afterlife. But it was all looted long ago, during Antiquity. Above the roof of the king's chamber, there are 5 compartments that were presumably meant to safeguard the king's chamber from the possibility of the roof collapsing. This is why these compartments were called relief chambers. It is in these compartments that graffiti left by workers was discovered in the 19th century, helping to attribute the pyramid to Cheops. I mentioned before that after Khufu, the size of the pyramids decreased. The rest of the Giza site, which has three main pyramids and smaller ones, was approximately built over about a century. However, the others are smaller, and after the Fourth Dynasty, the size of the pyramids decreased. These stone block cores were replaced by bricks. The Fourth Dynasty was during the Old Kingdom. In the Middle Kingdom, the practice of building pyramids declined over time. During the New Kingdom, in its second millennium BC, the second half of the millennium, pharaohs and nobles preferred to be buried in underground tombs that still required work, but nothing like the effort of building a pyramid like Khufu's. So, why did they stop building pyramids? There may not be a single reason, but it is likely that this practice had become unsustainable for Egypt as a country and as a society, possibly for ecological reasons. I mentioned earlier that the consumption of wood, especially as fuel for making mortar, was huge in a country with little wood. It could also be for social reasons. Pharaohs may have been seen as living gods, but there wasn't much a society was willing to accept to honor them. Pharaohs continued to build, but increasingly invested in smaller temples or monuments that may have been seen as more useful and more acceptable. In any case, there was also a temple associated with the pyramid, presumably dedicated to the cult of Khufu after his death. It was located on the east side of the pyramid and has almost completely disappeared. There was also a causeway linking the pyramid to the river, of which only a few remains remained. To the east of the pyramid was a cemetery where the grave of Khufu's mother was found, but her coffin was empty, even though it had been sealed and never violated. This may be another mysterious story that happened there, and we'll never know what really happened. Much of the archaeological work at this site has also involved studying the environment. These studies have revealed that there was once a thriving port, so there was likely economic activity, perhaps around the temple of Khufu. There were barracks for soldiers or laborers, and many remnants left by the thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of men who worked, ate, lived, and slept on the site, forming a village or even a temporary city. If only the thousands of workers who contributed to this creation of one of humanity's most impressive ancient monuments could speak. Perhaps the mystery of how exactly the pyramid was built could be explained. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep, or you may want to listen to another story in my library. We have a story about Egyptian mythology, which is a great companion to this one. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.